Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you that are wanting some extra Algebra 1 kind of extension work, these are going to be some of the topics that we did not get to after spring break, but I'm hoping to put out a video once a week just to kind of give you a preview. Remember, these are not required and these will not impact your grade in any way, shape, or form, but just in case you were wanting to kind of work to see what we were going to do. If we recall, right before spring break, we had talked about multiplying monomials, binomials, and trinomials. And especially when we were multiplying binomials together, we had our double distribute, or we had a little acronym for that double distribute, which was called FOIL. And if we recall, that was first times first, so x times x would give us x squared. Outside times outside, so x times negative 6 is negative 6x. Inside times inside would be plus 2x. And then last times last is negative 12. And then remember, we are going to go ahead and combine our two middle terms together. And our final answer is x squared minus 4x minus 12. And then we end up with our trinomial. And then if we looked at our next one, if we had x plus 6 times x minus 5, once again using our double distribute or FOIL pattern, first times first is x squared. Outside times outside is minus 5x. Inside times inside plus 6x. And then finally, last times last gives us minus 30. And we're going to go ahead and add those two middle terms together. And we have x squared plus 1x minus 30. And then our very last one, we have that 4x minus 5 times 4x plus 5. Notice that the first two terms are the same, and our last two terms happen to be opposites of each other. So let's look and see what happens with this. When we're going to go first times first, we end up with 16x squared. Outside times outside plus 20x. Inside times inside minus 20x. And then finally, last times last, minus 25. And then our two middle terms, notice they're opposite of each other, and we end up with 16x squared minus 25. And those two middle terms cancel out, and we're going to talk about that because that is a special product. Right before spring break, we had talked about how when we factored out a GCF, greatest common factor, that we were basically undoing the distributive property. And now what we're going to be doing is factoring, and we're going to be working backwards. We're going to be starting with this, and we're going to try to end up with our two binomials. So factoring is ultimately the undoing of the distributive property or the undoing of our FOIL pattern. So the first type of factoring we're going to look at is factoring our special product, and that happens to be the difference of two squares. If we recall, difference means subtraction, and two squares means that both of our terms have to be perfect squares. So if we recall from way back, our perfect squares are going to be numbers like 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36, 49, 64, 81, 100, 121, 144, 169, 196, and then another perfect square is like x squared, or even x to the 4th, or x to the 6th, or x to the 8th. What makes this a difference, meaning subtraction, of two squares if we have a squared minus b squared? So for example, this is a perfect square. And this is a perfect square. Their factors are going to be a plus b and a minus b. So ultimately what we would be doing is taking the square root of each of those. So for example, if we had something like 4x squared minus 25. Notice that 4 is one of those perfect squares. The 25 is a perfect square, and the x squared is also a perfect square. So this factors into 2x plus 5 and 2x minus 5, because 2x is the square root of 4x squared. 5 is the square root of 25. And notice with this, if I did do my FOIL pattern and went first, outer, inner, last, we end up with 4x squared minus 10x plus 10x minus 25. And those two middle terms cancel out. So our final answer for that problem with our difference of two squares is those two factors. The other type of factoring we're going to look at is what happens when we're factoring our leading coefficient is 1. So that means now we have a trinomial, 1, 2, 3 terms. That's in our standard form, remember, largest to smallest exponent. And our leading coefficient, so the number in front of the x squared, happens to be 1. So what we're going to do, first thing, since this is going to be two factors, we're going to have two binomials. So we want to make sure it's in standard form. On our assignment this evening, it's all going to be done for us. And we're going to set up our two binomials. So we're going to set up our two sets of parentheses. Okay. Then we're going to look for two numbers that multiply to be their last term, but add to be the middle. So right now we're going to look for two numbers that multiply together to be 12. And different ways to get 12, remember, would be 1 and 12, 2 and 6, and then 3 and 4. However, if we added those together, 1 plus 12 is 13, 2 plus 6 is 8, 3 plus 4 is 7. But notice we're wanting to get this to be -8. So that's really important. So we have to remember, not only is a positive times a positive going to give us a positive number, but we also know a negative times a negative gives us a positive. So we could also have -1 and -12, -2 and -6, and -3 and -4. And look what happens when we add those together. We end up with -13, -8, and -7. So ultimately, looking at this, since we wanted two numbers that multiply together to be 12, but add to be -8, we're going to have to use this combination of negative and a negative. So then our factors become x minus 2 and x minus 6. And ultimately, once again, we should check this out and we can multiply them back together. But always check that middle term, because if we're going to multiply these together, we end up with -6x. That one is -2x. And notice when I add those together, we end up with that -8x. So our factors would be x minus 2 and x minus 6. So let's go ahead and try a few more on the next page. So let's look at our, scooch that up, next one. X squared plus 8x plus 7. So once again, we want two numbers that multiply together, in this case to be 7, but add to be 8. So two numbers multiplied together to be 7 would be 1 and 7, and then -1 and -7. But we know we're actually not going to have to worry about the negatives because our middle term is also positive. And so 1 plus 7 is 8. -1 plus -7 is -8. So here would be the two values that work for us. So then our factors are x plus 1 and x plus 7. Once again, please check your outer term. So that would be 7x, and our inner term 1x, and look, they do add to be 8. So x plus 1, x plus 7 happens to be our final answer. The next one, little trickier. X squared plus 5x minus 36. So we need two numbers multiplied together that's -36 that add to be 5. So we have -36. And to remember to get a negative number, we need a positive number and a negative number. I like to kind of go in chronological and go -1 and 36. -2 and 18. -3 and 12. -4 and 9. So let's go ahead and double check their sums really quick. So -1 and 36 happens to give us 35. -2 and 18 would be 16. -3 and 12 is 9. -4 and 9 happens to be 5. And notice that's what we are looking for. Two numbers multiplied together that's -36 that happen to add together to be 5. So here would be our two numbers. So now we would have x minus 4 and x plus 9. Always double check. Outside 9x, inside -4x. Add those together and we do get 5x. So our factors are x minus 4 and x plus 9. Let's look at the next one. X squared plus 10x plus 16. So we want two numbers multiplied together that's 16 that add to be 10. So 16, we've got 1 and 16, 2 and 8, and 4 and 4. So when we add those together, and notice we don't have to worry about our negatives because that middle term is also positive. So when we add these together, 1 plus 16 is 17, 2 plus 8 is 10, and 4 plus 4 is 8. So the value we're looking for, the two numbers we're looking for are 2 and 8. So our factors are going to be x plus 2 and x plus 8. Once again, double check outside 8x, inside 2x, add those together, and yes, that is 10x. So our final answer would be x plus 2 and x plus 8. And our last one of these, we've got x squared plus 8x minus 48. So once again, with that negative number right there, negative 48, we're going to need a positive number and we need a negative number. So we need two numbers multiplied together. That's negative 48, but add to be positive 8. So negative 48, one of them has to be a positive number and one of them has to be a negative number. So we're going to go ahead and start with negative 1 and 48, negative 2 and 24, negative 3 and 16, negative 4 and 12, negative 6 and 8. And what happens when we add those together? We end up with negative 1 plus 48 is 47. Negative 2 plus 24 is 22. Negative 3 plus 16 is 13. Negative 4 plus 12 is 8. And then negative 6 plus 8 is 2. And notice right here we want a positive 8. So we know those two, negative 4 and 12, would have to be our answer. Now, hypothetically, if we needed that to be a negative 8, we know we could just switch the signs right there if need be. So now our factors, we are going to be x minus 4 and x plus 12. Always double check outer terms, 12x, inner terms, negative 4x, and yes, those do add to be positive 8. So our answer, x minus 4 and x plus 12. And then our last two little problems. Remember the other one we kind of looked at happens to be that difference of two squares. And if we look, and this is the same one that was on the other side, 4x squared minus 25. This is a perfect square. This is our perfect square. And these happen to factor into, notice there's no middle term. We are also subtracting. So that is 2x plus 5 and 2x minus 5. And if you wanted to check your middle terms, our outer term is negative 10x, our middle term is positive 10x, and notice there would add to be 0, and there is no middle term. So our answer is 2x plus 5 and 2x minus 5. And definitely last but definitely not least, 36x squared minus 1. 36 is a perfect square. 1 is also a perfect square, and we are subtracting, so hence them being called difference of two squares. So now when we're going to factor this, the square root of 36, x squared, is 6x. The square root of 1 is 1, so 6x plus 1, 6x minus 1. And if we want to check, that would give us negative 6x. That is positive 6x. Those cancel out, and notice we don't have that middle term. So then our final answer is 6x plus 1, 6x minus 1. And that is it this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you've enjoyed this. I will try to make sure I have something out new for you to do at least once a week, but if not more, but definitely plan on once a week if you're interested. This is something that you will be using a whole heck of a lot in the rest of your mathematical career. Factoring happens to be one of my favorite things to do, so I was very disappointed we didn't get to do that before spring break. So I hope you enjoyed this. I've enjoyed reaching out to you. I will hopefully have something posted again next Monday. Have a good night. Bye-bye.